The day an 82-year-old millionaire offered me a marriage that could save my mother's life. I thought he had lost his mind. I had no idea that saying yes would eventually teach me what love, loyalty, and sacrifice really meant. My name is Emily Parker, and I was 26 when my life took a turn I never expected. I worked as a waitress at a busy restaurant in Portland, Oregon. I wasn't living an exciting life. Most days were about working, paying bills, and worrying about my mother. Linda, my mother, had been sick for months. One morning, her doctor gave me news. That made my entire world stop. She needed a complicated operation. The cost was enormous. I didn't have the money. I had already used my savings. I had borrowed from friends. I had taken extra shifts at the restaurant and worked until my feet hurt. Still, it wasn't enough then. One afternoon, the hospital called. Emily, your mother needs the operation as soon as possible. I walked into the restaurant's storage room and closed the door behind me. I tried to stay calm. I couldn't. I covered my face and cried. How am I supposed to save her? Then I heard someone behind me. Perhaps I can help. I turned around. It was Richard Hayes. He was 82 years old and one of the wealthiest men in the city. He owned several businesses and properties, but unlike most wealthy customers, he rarely spoke about money. He visited our restaurant almost every afternoon. He always sat alone near the window. Over the months, he had seen my manager shout at me. He had noticed how tired I looked. He had watched me continue working even when I clearly wanted to collapse. Now he pulled out a chair. Sit down. Emily, I wiped my tears. Want to bother you? You aren't bothering me. I finally told him everything. My mother's illness, then. Operation. The money. The fear that I might lose. Her. Richard listened quietly. Then he said something that left me speechless. I want to marry you. I stared at him for several seconds. Neither of us spoke. Then I laughed nervously. You can't be serious. I am. He explained that his children, Daniel and Claire, had been pressuring him to move into a care facility. Richard didn't want that. He wanted someone he could trust around him, someone who would treat him like a person rather than a bank account. His proposal was simple. He would pay for my mother's operation in return. I would marry him for 5 years, live in his home, and help him with everyday life. There would be separate bedrooms. There would be boundaries. Nothing would be forced. I looked at him in disbelief. You barely know me. I know. Enough, he said. I thought about my mother. I thought about the hospital room. I thought about the possibility of losing the only family I had. My eyes filled with tears. Will you really pay for the operation? Richard nodded. Every dollar. That night, I barely slept. I knew what people would say. A young woman marrying an 82-year-old wealthy man. Everyone would assume I wanted his money. Maybe he would hate me. Maybe they would laugh at me. But if accepting his offer meant my mother could live, could I really say no? 3 days later, Richard and I stood inside a quiet courthouse. There were no flowers, no guests, no celebration. Just 2 signatures. My hand shook as I signed the marriage papers. Richard signed beside me, and suddenly, I was married that same evening. He took me to his enormous home. It looked more like a private hotel than a house. Everything was beautiful, but the silence inside made it feel strangely empty. My bedroom was enormous. My closet was filled with clothes I had never dreamed of owning, yet I didn't feel rich. I felt trapped. I kept reminding myself that this was an agreement. 5 years. That was all Then came the phone call I had been waiting for. My mother's operation was successful. She was going to live. I broke down, crying for the first time in months. I could breathe, but just when I thought the hardest part was over, Richard took me to dinner at a crowded restaurant. The moment we entered, people began staring. Whispers followed us across the room. Someone laughed. Another person said I was probably waiting for Richard to die. My face burned with shame. I wanted to leave. Then Richard quietly reached across the table and took my hand. "Let them talk," he said. I looked into his eyes. There was something different about him that night. Something lonely. Something almost broken. And for the first time, I wondered whether I had married a wealthy old man or a lonely human being who desperately needed someone to stand beside him. Then the restaurant doors opened. Two people walked inside. Richard's children. Daniel and Claire. They looked directly at me, and from the anger in their eyes, I knew they had not come to welcome their father's new wife. They had come for war. Daniel and Claire didn't even sit down before they began attacking me. Daniel looked at Richard. "Father, what were you thinking?" Claire folded her arms. "She's young enough to be your granddaughter." Felt my face turn hot. Richard remained silent. Then Daniel looked directly at me. "You married him for his money?" I wanted to defend myself. I wanted to tell them about my mother, but the words wouldn't come because a small part of me feared they were right. I had accepted Richard's offer because I desperately needed money, so I lowered my eyes. Richard suddenly placed his hand firmly on the table. "That's enough." His voice was calm, but there was strength behind it. "Emily is my wife. You will treat her with respect." Claire shook her head. "This isn't over." Daniel stood. "We'll see you in court." They walked away. I looked at Richard. "I'm sorry for what?" "For everything." Richard shook his head. "You have nothing to apologize for." That night I couldn't sleep. Around midnight, I heard piano music coming from downstairs. I quietly walked into the living room. Richard was sitting at an old black Teles piano. His fingers moved slowly across the keys. The melody was beautiful, but there was sadness in it. Then I noticed something that broke my heart. Tears were running down his face. I didn't want to disturb him, so I started to leave. He noticed me. "Emily." I stopped. "Would you like some tea?" He nodded. A few minutes later, I returned with 2 cups. Richard took it slowly. Then he began telling me about his past. His first wife had been named Margaret. He had loved her deeply, but when they were young, Richard had been obsessed with building his business. He worked constantly. He missed family dinners. He missed birthdays. He missed important moments with his children. When Margaret became seriously ill, Richard was still working by the time he realized what he had lost. It was too late. She died years ago. Richard never forgave himself. "I gave my children everything money could buy," he whispered, "but I forgot to give them myself." I didn't know what to say, so I simply held his hand. For the first time, I saw Richard differently. He wasn't just a wealthy businessman. He was an old man carrying decades of regret. After that night, something changed between us. Not romance, not anything physical, something much simpler. Friendship. Trust. I began cooking for him. We drank tea together. I read books when his eyes became tired. We talked about childhood memories, dreams, mistakes, and the things we wished we could change. Slowly, the mansion stopped feeling like a prison. It started feeling like a home. 3 months passed. Richard smiled more. I laughed more. Then one morning, everything changed. I was carrying his breakfast into the dining room when I noticed something was wrong. Richard's cup slipped. From his hand, he tried to speak. Nothing came out. One side of his face had suddenly weakened. Richard. I immediately called emergency services. The ambulance arrived quickly at the hospital. Doctors rushed him into treatment. Hours later, a doctor finally came out. Mr. Hayes suffered a serious stroke. My heart sank. Is he going to be okay? He is alive, but he's unconscious. The next few days will be critical. I stayed beside his bed. I held his hand. I talked to him. I told him about my mother. I told him about the garden he wanted to plant. I told him he couldn't leave yet. Then Daniel arrived. He looked at me without emotion. You need to leave. I'm his wife. Not anymore. I stared at him. What? Daniel had security remove me from the room. I pleaded. I cried. Nobody listened when I returned to Richard's house. I discovered the locks had been changed. My clothes had been placed outside. Daniel stood at the door. Father is too sick to make decisions. Now, he said, you have no place here. I looked at the mansion behind him, then at my clothes. Scattered on the ground, I had lost everything, but I wasn't thinking about the house. I was thinking about Richard. I drove back to the hospital and waited in my car. One night became 2, then 3. I barely slept on the 4th morning. A nurse came outside. Emily. I jumped out of the car. Yes. Richard woke up. I ran inside. Security tried to stop me, but I pushed past them. When I entered his room, I froze. Richard was awake, but he looked completely different. One side of his body was weak. His speech was difficult. Daniel stood beside him with Claire and several lawyers. One lawyer explained that they planned to move Richard into a long-term care facility. I looked at Richard. His eyes met mine. Then he slowly lifted his good hand. He pointed toward me. His lips moved. I couldn't understand the words, but I understood the message. He wanted me. I stepped forward. I am his wife. Daniel laughed. You are a waitress. I looked directly at him. Maybe I was a waitress. Then I looked at Richard, but I'm also the person who stayed when everyone else walked away. Room became silent, and for the first time, I decided I wasn't going to let anyone take Richard away from me. The lawyers argued for nearly an hour. They told me I didn't have enough money. They told me I didn't have a large enough home. They questioned whether I could care for Richard. Daniel stood behind them with a satisfied expression. Then I placed our marriage documents on the table. I am his legal wife. The room went silent. Richard looked at me. His eyes filled with tears. I promised him I would care for him. Myself, not because of his fortune, not because of the house. Because I couldn't abandon someone who had once saved my mother's life and had become my closest friend. Eventually, the lawyers had to accept the legal reality. Richard came home with me, but the mansion was no longer ours. Daniel had taken control of it. So I rented a small house outside the city. It wasn't impressive. The kitchen was tiny. The living room was old, but it was warm, and it was ours. The days that followed were difficult. Richard couldn't walk properly. I helped him with his meals. I organized his medication. I helped him with physical therapy, exercises. Some days he became frustrated. Some days I cried. when he couldn't see me, but we kept trying. One morning, Richard managed to take 3 steps. Only 3. But I cried as if he had won a championship. He smiled. I did it. I said, you did. Months passed. Then, Daniel started spreading rumors. He claimed I was controlling Richard. He accused me of wanting his fortune. He even tried to convince people that I was keeping him away from his family. Eventually, I received a legal notice. There would be a formal hearing. Daniel wanted the court to remove me from Richard's life. I was terrified, but Richard had been working quietly on something. Every day. He practiced speaking every day. He worked on walking. He refused to give up the day of the hearing. Arrived, I entered the room alone. Daniel and Claire were all ready. Their lawyers began presenting accusations. I tried to answer them, but every question made me feel smaller than the door. Opened, everyone turned. Richard entered in a wheelchair. A nurse stood behind him. Daniel immediately stood. Father, what are you doing here? Richard didn't answer. He slowly placed his hands on the wheelchair. Then he pushed himself upward. His legs shook. His entire body trembled. But he stood. The room became completely silent. Richard looked at Daniel, then Claire, then me. His voice was weak, but every word was clear. I choose Emily. Daniel's face went pale. Richard explained that Emily had cared for him when he was at his weakest. She had never demanded his money. She had never asked for luxury. She had stayed because she cared. Then Richard announced that most of his remaining fortune would be donated to charity. His children would receive nothing unless they had learned to respect him as a father rather than treat him like an inheritance. The hearing ended. Daniel had lost, but Richard wasn't finished that evening. He opened a drawer at home. Inside was the original marriage agreement. He placed it on the table, then he tore it in half. I stared at him. What are you doing? He handed me a large check. I don't want you to feel trapped anymore. I shook my head. You aren't trapping me? You're 27 now, he said slowly. You deserve a future, friends, adventures, a life with someone your own age. I looked at the check. It could have changed my life. Then I tore it into pieces. Richard stared at me. Why? Because I don't want to stay because of money. I took his hand. I stayed because somewhere along the way, our agreement became something else. He looked at me with tears in his eyes. We became family. I whispered. Years passed. We eventually sold the mansion and moved to a quiet countryside home. We planted flowers. We adopted 2 older dogs that nobody wanted. Richard spent his afternoons in the garden while I sat beside him. Our life became simple, but it became peaceful. His health slowly declined. One quiet morning, I sat beside his bed. Richard opened his eyes. He smiled. I was lucky, he whispered. No, I said. We were lucky. He squeezed my hand. Thank you, Emily. Those were his final words. Richard passed away peacefully at 80-5. I was 29. On his desk, I found a letter he had written for me. It said that when he first met me, he believed he was making a practical arrangement. But instead, I had given him something money had never been able to buy. A second chance at being loved. I cried for days, but eventually, the sadness became gratitude. People had judged our marriage. Some said I had married Richard for money. Others said I had wasted my youth. They never knew what happened inside that quiet house. They never saw the difficult mornings, the small victories, the Laughter dot the tears. They never saw two people from completely different generations become. Family dot standing beside Richard's grave. I placed a bouquet of flowers on the ground. I kept my promise, I whispered. The agreement had lasted 5 years, but the friendship had lasted much longer, and the love we found wasn't about age, wealth, or appearances. It was about being there when someone needed you most. I walked away from the grave with tears in my eyes. My life wasn't over. It was beginning again, and I knew Richard would always remain a part of my story. If this story touched your heart, tell me in the comments, would you have made the same choice Emily did? And don't forget to subscribe for more emotional stories.